Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Ely.
And I'm Daniel Chen. We're just a couple guys talking about some stuff.
The stuff we've been talking about has been a biblical theology on race. This is part 8. This is our last episode in this series. Hope it's been a help. It's been really interesting to dive into like the biblical storyline of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and how that applies to, the concept of race and ethnicity. We've critiqued Christian nationalism and critical race theory. We've talked about how to have, healthy conversations about race. And today we're just going to be answering some frequently asked questions we've received throughout the series.
Yeah, I think I'm excited to answer these questions. Hopefully it'll be helpful for everyone listening. And if you guys have additional questions for us, we'd love to talk to you in person. We were even just chatting. It's just impossible. It's impossible to get all our thoughts across and the nuances of all
Just
of this.
no way. Yep.
There's no way. So,
absolutely. But we'd like to begin today, as always, with our life hack.
So this is a life hack that I may have done at the beginning, but our worship pastor Willie asked, is there a way to figure out if there's 31 days in a month? And so I'm going to do this one again. And if you
good old knuckle trick.
Yeah, so if you put your knuckles together. Also, the other reason I'm doing this is because my wife was like, I feel like your life hacks have just become an infomercial where I'm like, buy this product. And so, you know what? That's a good point. Yeah. I'm going to do some more like at home, like you already have
an at-home life hack.
Life hacks.
Yeah.
So this one, if you put your knuckles together, starting with your left pinky knuckle. I guess really you could go either way, but I'm right-handed, so left pinky knuckle. Mm-hmm. That's January. Mm-hmm. Then the little like valley, February, mm-hmm. March, April, May. You just go down, and so what you see is it alternates every other 31 days, not 31 days, except for July and August both have 31 days.
Okay, so the some of the high knuckles are 30.
No. So
all the high ones are 31.
Yeah.
Okay.
And all the valleys are 30 except for February.
There you go. Life hack.
Yeah. So even that, man. So if you're ever wondering,
just put your knuckles together and start counting.
I actually do this.
Yeah.
When people ask.
There you go.
Yeah.
And now it is time for our Restaurant of the Month segment, and we are doing something that we've never done in Monday Musings history. We have a joint Restaurant of the Month.
Oh, yeah.
And it's Asian Kitchen. And this is a repeat Restaurant of the Month. But they're just so amazing. They're so generous. And their food is so good.
It is.
That they deserve not only a repeat Restaurant of the Month, they deserve both of us to pick them.
So please go.
Support to Asian Kitchen.
A local business. Maybe what we'll do, you give a recommendation for a dish.
Oh, sesame chicken.
So
always my
here's the thing. Their meat quality is super high quality.
Yeah.
It's actually so high quality that it almost like doesn't make sense to me for a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, it's really good.
Most Chinese restaurants, even the good ones, don't use meat quality like this. It's very high quality.
Yeah.
I'm going to give 2 recommendations.
Okay.
The first is the Mongolian steak.
Yep,
I've
fantastic.
been really impressed by.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's actual steak.
Yes.
It's actual flank steak.
Yep.
The flavor is just amazing too. And the second one is called the Happy Family. And it's all their meats with some vegetables.
Beautiful.
And I get it with fried rice. And it's a little pricey, but once again, meat quality is super high. You could really get 2 meals out of it anyways, because it's a ton of food.
Yeah, and then you're a happy family at the end. So
And then you're a happy family. So So yeah, go to Asian Kitchen. Order from Asian Kitchen and just tip Jenny so well.
Yeah.
She's the best.
They're fantastic.
They're the best.
Yeah.
I can't say it enough.
We can't say it enough. Go to Asian Kitchen.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is our last episode on race, and today we're doing some kind of frequently asked questions we've received. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 7 questions we're going to go through. The first one is this: what about reparations? going to start with a softball.
So I was about to say we're starting with the softball.
This one's really easy. Should take about 5 seconds to answer.
Right.
Yes or no? 1, 2, 3, go. Go. Go.
Oh, man.
Go.
I thought we were about to say it. I was about to just blatantly lay it out there.
So I guess we could start with, what reparations, the idea that African-American families should be awarded some kind of sum of money or some kind of compensation for the years that their ancestors were enslaved and were not paid for their work.
Sure. That's often how it's talked about it in the U.S.
Right.
Obviously, you could have reparations in non-U.S. countries.
Sure.
And also, I've heard reparations kind of used for Native Americans as well.
Yep.
But it's generally talked about from that lens.
Right, from the issue of slavery in the United States.
Yeah.
Generally my thought, the Old Testament does prescribe the idea of reparations, or you could say restitution. So, for example, Exodus 22:1 says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 ox for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So the idea of if you wrong someone, you need to restore what you wronged 4 or 5-fold.
Right.
But the principle in the Old Testament is very much a person who wrongs another person makes that restitution.
Correct.
This is what we see Zacchaeus doing, not out of legalism, but out of an overflow of grace.
It's actually not out of the law,
but out of a heart to give who he defrauded in the Gospel of Luke. Also, a lot of times the Exodus is cited, where Israel basically plunders the Egyptians, and it's almost probably, honestly, about 400 years worth of wages that they didn't receive. I think in general the principle is really clear. When we wrong someone, we should make that whole.
Yes.
I think when you get generations and generations and generations removed, and you have all kind of complexities related to like immigration.
Right.
So like, not every white person in the South today is a descendant of slave owners.
Yeah.
Many came from different parts of Europe, right? And not every black person is a descendant of slaves.
Of course.
So just like the practical necessity of it, I think becomes really difficult in tracking down how do you quantify kind of maybe like lost generational wealth because of slavery, and then how do you quantify like who should pay for it? And I understand a lot of people would say, well, you're just avoiding the conversation by talking about the particulars. And I would just say I think reparations would have been really appropriate right after slavery was abolished.
Right.
It seems like this was actually Lincoln's goal.
Yeah.
So you had General Sherman, execute an order that later became known as 40 Acres and a Mule to thousands of black families, that was actually rescinded after Lincoln's assassination.
Right.
So it seems like there was this idea, and I think the further you get from that moment, I think the harder it gets to do this justly.
Right.
That's kind of my thoughts about it.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think when you take the biblical principle, there's some gray area, right? Because I think as like on a personal level, like if I, knock over someone's mailbox, I should go pay for that mailbox, right? That's the right thing to do. That's the principle.
Yep. Easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what about on a systemic governmental level? Man, that gets a little complicated.
Yep.
I agree with you. I think if that, what was it again? 40 Acres and a Mule?
Yeah.
If that had happened, I could look back in history and say 100% support that.
Man, you do, as a side note, you do just have to wonder how our history would have looked differently if Lincoln hadn't have been assassinated.
I know, man.
Reconstruction would have looked very
different. Yeah. Man, because I think there's a practicality to it, right?
Right.
I think now we're just far enough removed. It's just impractical. right? There's too many questions. Like, for example, we were chatting. Like, I'm a citizen of this country. My ancestors, my parents were the first ones in the U.S., right? Out of my family. So, what do you do with me?
Right.
Right. Obviously, we weren't slave owners in the South or even the North. We weren't slave owners in the U.S., nor were our, ancestors slaves. So, where do the tens of millions of people who are Hispanic and Asian and brown people, that aren't?
Yep.
It's not what the non-white and black people, which is a lot of our country now. What do you do with that? What do you do with the, if your family was from your white family and your family immigrated in the 50s, what do you do about that?
Right.
There's just too many questions.
Yep.
I think too, as well, for me, I think a lot of the talk about reparations is, kind of this like getting what you owe kind of idea. And what I want to say is I think the solution to a lot of the pain from people who have experienced racism and the horrible things we've been talking about for the past 8 weeks.
Right.
The only solution, in my opinion, you find in the New Testament isn't just what Zacchaeus did, but what Jesus did, which is forgiveness.
Right.
Our entire basis of what we believe about Christianity is based on an innocent man, and who is fully God as well,
Sure.
Jesus, who took and paid the price of the sins of non-innocent people.
Right.
That's how we get forgiveness. That's how we get grace, right? But I think about this too. If you, for the many people who have been hurt, whether it's Native Americans or African Americans here in the U.S., and you experiencing pain and hurt and anger for what has happened, you getting a large sum of money or monthly money, does that make that pain and hurt go away? I don't think so, right? I think the only way we can achieve that people can achieve peace and unity when they have been wronged, and it is ultimately through forgiveness. Obviously, there's other things too, and once again, like with the reparations question, there's a time element here that makes it very complex.
Yeah.
If it was yesterday, okay, we're having a different conversation.
Yep.
I would still push the forgiveness piece as the ultimate thing.
Right.
But there's other practical things that make more sense.
There's like forgiveness is the solution toward the individual.
Right.
Maybe not always the system, I guess is how you could put it.
Right.
You know.
Right. And so I'm just going to keep pushing the forgiveness piece because
you can control that.
Yeah, that's the only thing you can control.
Yep.
Right? Right?
Yep.
And that doesn't mean you don't fight for what you think is right, but I'm just talking on an individual internal level. Mm-hmm. The way you get rid of anytime you get rid of anger or hatred towards someone who wronged you is forgiveness.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, that's good.
Like the pain, for example, I experienced from a guy who bullied me when I was younger. He could give me a car. I mean, I'd be like, oh, great, new car. But that doesn't make my years of trauma go away.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Forgiveness is the only thing that brings that healing.
Yep.
And so what I would say is, I think on a practical level, there's been too much time. Mm-hmm. On an internal, personal level, we look at Christ and say, how do we give grace and forgiveness? And which, don't get me wrong, I understand that's not an easy thing for me to say.
Right.
Forgiving someone may be the hardest thing that anyone can do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I also think like the concept of reparations aren't the only way to address some like generational wealth gaps.
Right.
So an example of this, something that was passed during the Trump administration, I think championed by Senator Tim Scott, who is African-American from South Carolina, was the idea of opportunity zones.
Right.
And opportunity zones were economic development in distressed areas in the United States. So it wasn't necessarily race-based, but it was a way to encourage economic growth and job creation in low-income communities.
Right.
And so, one of the ways to help kind of solve the generational wealth gap is to create jobs and to help spur people on at the bottom of the economic ladder to give them dignity and help. And so I think opportunity zones is an example of reparations aren't the only way to help. So it's not like you either care or don't care, and if you care, you have to support reparations, and if you don't care, you just say no, and you avoid any potentially generational issues.
Right.
So I think that there are ways to get creative, I guess.
Right. And there's so many rabbit holes you can go down to because I think something that's worth a conversation that we won't get in here too is a lot of times when this conversation comes up, it's about equity of wealth, right? Not equality, right? And so
it's a quality of outcome, not a quality of opportunity.
Right.
Right. And you don't have equal outcomes in life. That's not how it works.
Right. And I think accepting that, right? So I think last week, the Marxist view says everyone's outcome,
has to be the same.
Has to be the same. It's just impractical.
And it's like, I'm a 5'10" white guy. I'm not going to play for the NBA.
Yeah.
Nor should I.
Right. Ever.
That's not an equal outcome. Right.
Right.
So,
exactly. There's, and I think what we should focus on is equity of humanity.
Right.
Of value.
Yep.
Of worth in terms of God, image bearer, imago Dei worth.
Yes.
There's a lot of discussion, but I think over if there should be this equity of wealth, but I think equity of wealth is a very American way to look at this.
Yes.
And it's a very American dream way to look at this. And I would say that's something you should really think about, right? Because in every country, everywhere of all time, there were rich people and poor people. It's impossible. I don't care what ideology you come from. I don't care if you're communist or you're capitalist. There's rich people, there's poor people.
In every country in the world ever, there have been groups that have been marginalized and groups that have arisen to power through coercive means. And so the question of how far back do you go? And, you eventually get to Genesis 3. If you just keep pulling that thread,
Yeah, exactly. I think once again, equity in terms of humanity is what we're looking for.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good word. All right. I'm sure that was unsatisfying, but there are 10-minute thoughts on reparations. What do you think about white privilege? Question number 2. That's another easy one. Thanks for the softball. You know who you are who asked this question. So since I'm white, I'll start with this one, I suppose. I think I don't satisfy both groups with my answer.
I will probably land in that
because
too.
I give a yes and a no. So I'd say on one end, yes. I think there are all kinds of privilege. And I actually heard J.D. Greer say this. I thought it was really helpful. There's tall people privilege.
Sure.
There's dark hair privilege.
There's definitely beautiful person privilege.
Yeah. There's deep voice privilege. I don't know if you've heard the guy who was the actor that actually played Darth Vader, but when you hear him talk, it's like, who is that? And then you hear James Earl Jones talk as Darth Vader. You're like, oh, that's who should be Darth Vader.
Right. Yes.
Voice privilege.
You meant the guy who's in the suit.
The guy in the suit. Yeah. It's weird.
I was like, James Earl Jones.
Yeah.
I'm like, that guy's awesome.
Yeah, awesome. Right. So voice privilege. There are all kinds of privileges. And, like you said, life's not equal. We shouldn't expect equality of outcome. I think there are different kinds of privileges, and everyone has certain kind of privileges that you were kind of born with that benefit you in the society that you live in. Now, then there's the question of
having two parents in the household.
Having two parents is right. And so then the question is whiteness a privilege? And I would say, to a certain degree, in the United States, yes. I think it's probably more accurate to call it majority culture privilege, because I think that's more true from country to country.
Right. So the way we use white privilege in society today is a cultural Marxist idea that comes out of CRT.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe in that just because of the melanin in your skin,
right,
that you have inherent leg up because of your melanin count.
Right. No.
I would say no.
Right.
And that's why we redefine it as majority culture privilege, is kind of a term that we've kind of thrown around.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with that.
But because I do think, like, and here's an example of what I would say is a majority culture privilege. I really don't think about my race.
Sure.
Ever.
Right.
Except when we're doing a 25-part series on race
on
our podcast. I don't think about it.
Right.
I think that's a privilege. Any majority culture in any country enjoys that privilege to not have to think about it.
Right.
It's just really not a thing you consider.
Right.
But I think that's not because I'm white. It's because I'm the majority culture here. The majority culture sets the norms of any society, and that's not a bad thing. No, every society is a society. Every culture is a culture. There are norms and unnorms, and that's just the way it is.
For example, do you have white privilege in Iran?
No.
No. That's a big no.
I've been in a taxi in Turkey, and my whiteness was a big problem for me.
Right.
No privilege.
And that's
there.
why you can't. Like, that's why
it's not this universal.
Yeah. That's why. Yeah, and that's why we define it as majority culture privilege, because the majority culture there, right, has the quote unquote privilege, right? You raised in that culture, the culture that set the norms, right? You have a leg up if you were raised in that like normative culture,
right?
Right.
I also think this is important. This is kind of also related to systemic racism, and that also depends on how you define it, right?
Right.
A CRT definition of systemic racism is it's an embedded norm that will just always be there.
Right.
A definition I would more prefer, that I think is more accurate, is if you have laws on the books in the system,
right,
that prefer a certain race or another, or persecute a certain race or another, that is systemic racism.
Right.
Jim Crow laws were systemic racism. A white person in that environment certainly has a privilege over a black person, because the laws of the land are actually targeted against a certain race.
Right.
So it certainly can happen. But I think that the idea of whiteness as like a thing is like a CRT concept.
It is.
And I think I would reject that kind of thinking along it. But yeah, everyone, and here's the deal of
I'll just say this. You have contradictory terms in white privilege and white trash, which both exist in our culture.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, you both can't be 100% true by those definitions, right? Because there's plenty of white people who grow up in extreme poverty, or their parents are like meth heads, or I mean, I'm just saying that's kind of like a stereotype.
No, but I think it's a very good point.
That what privilege do they have?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
In the society, when you talk about jobs and college and all that stuff, right? And so, I think you do have the people who control. You do have the people who control the power dynamics in any, I don't care, country, university system, job. Yeah, those people who that have the power will naturally and subconsciously relate with and give preferential treatment to people who they deem more like them. Maybe it's because of race. Maybe it's because of height. Maybe it's because of background. You grew up in the same city. You know, like.
And what I'd say from like the Christian worldview, Philippians 2, right? Christ didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself and made himself nothing.
Right.
Whatever privilege you have,
right,
tall privilege, white privilege, whatever,
right,
whatever, like the society, like whatever you benefit from in society that maybe you didn't necessarily work for or it just happened, leverage it to serve other people.
Yeah.
Like that's the Christian response. It is not like divesting yourself of your privilege or whatever that means.
Right.
Whatever you got, use it to serve and love and care for other people. And so, I think that's the Christian
and I would say we don't live in caste system India, where it's impossible for you, if you're on the lowest caste, to go up a caste. Right. So what I would say is you may have been born with some natural privilege. Like, for example, it's actually psychologically proven beautiful people have an easier time in life.
Yeah, I would believe that.
Politicians, if you are good looking, you get naturally more votes because people think you're more trustworthy.
Yeah.
Right?
Sorry, ugly people.
Does that mean a medium to ugly looking person can't win an election? No. But if you tell yourself that person has beautiful person privilege and I don't, that means I'm stuck in this position where I can't ever win. Of course, your self-defeating attitude will almost like make your defeat happen, right?
Right.
And so if you have, if you're born in the majority culture, if you're a white person born in the suburbs and you're trying to get a job at a white suburban company, you may have a leg up. That's just the reality of it, right? So use that for the good of others.
Yep.
And if you don't have those privileges, don't put yourself in a hole and like rock back and forth weeping in that hole saying, I was born into this position and I can never get out. Mm-hmm. No, don't have that mentality.
Yep.
I just think in all things, some people have, the shortest player in the NBA is 5'3".
Wow.
Muggsy Bogues.
That's actually shorter than I would have.
5'3".
That's crazy.
Right? You would say, according to this idea of privilege, he could
not possible
ever become to the NBA.
Right.
No, I'm not saying that if you're 5'3", you could just work hard and become the NBA. There's things have to happen. Things have to happen. You have to still be gifted in certain ways, right? But what I'm saying is that, some people do have privileges, and some people. Everyone is born with some privileges, and everyone is born without those privileges.
Yep.
And I think don't let the way you were born into define the rest of your life.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. All right, next question, another easy one. How should I talk with people about race and policing? It looks like we've run out of time this morning on our podcast. Thanks for joining us. Race and policing. How do I talk to people about that?
Oh, man. Not online.
Yeah, not on Twitter. Not on Twitter.
Some people actually disagree with me.
That's a good start.
I posted this like Facebook thing being like, talking to people on Facebook is useless. And then I got a bunch of people come at me saying how it's super influential. I'm like,
you just proved my point.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, I'm not.
Whatever.
We're just coming from different viewpoints, I guess. But,
I think this one, it kind of goes back to a previous episode that we talked about, like honoring the image of God on part 5, how to, have conversations about race. The doctrine of creation gives us respect. The doctrine of fall gives us humility. The doctrine of redemption gives us grace. And the doctrine of restoration gives us patience. I think we should approach it with that. I think we need to recognize, there is an appropriate time to just listen, and there is an appropriate time to challenge.
Yes.
So if you have, honestly, the conversation about race and policing usually is about black people and policing almost even more specifically black men in policing.
Right.
It seems like most black men have a story
that we know
least,
personally.
Yeah, about encounter with police that was traumatic or semi-traumatic for them.
Right.
I think there's a time in those to just listen and say, I'm sorry.
Right.
And there's a right time to challenge any story. I think, one of the things about CRT is that your story has to be equal to facts.
Right.
And that's not true. So not our perceptions about things aren't always right. Sometimes they are. And just because you felt like it was racism doesn't mean it was, and it may have been. Right. But I think sometimes people jump too quickly into well, statistically speaking,
right.
Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, there is a time in these, it is right in these conversations about race and policing to bring up statistics and make sure we're not using statistics just to say whatever we want it to say, because you can make statistics say anything. So being smart about how we use statistics, there's a time to have those conversations, and there's just a time to listen. Right. And you need to just be smart and know the difference, I think.
Yeah. I got a phrase for you.
Okay.
Things can be subjectively valid, but not objectively true.
Yeah, that's
good. And so we want to validate people's experiences, right? Yeah. To say, if you were hurt by that, let me be a brother or sister in Christ to you in your hurts. Yep. And if you're there in tears, maybe you shouldn't bludgeon them with stats.
Right, that's what you're saying. Bad time.
Yeah. But at the same time, I have many stories where I've seen people use their experiences to justify perpetuating bad trains of thoughts even to their children that perpetuate this idea that black people should hate white cops, right, and all that stuff. Right. And I don't think that's a good thing either, mm-hmm. right? And so I would say there is a time to have that conversation, like you said, to challenge. Mm-hmm. But let's do both, right? Yeah. And I think it's okay to land in different places.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of that is true with this. But I think the Romans 13, submission to authorities, right, should create a respect and honor for police, right, in our culture. We should respect, appreciate, honor men and women who serve, right, and we should submit to the governing authorities. That's a way to do it, so right. That should flavor the conversation. But also the doctrine of the fall lets us know that people are sinful, and sin is present in every human's life. Right. And heart, and sin can creep into institutions as well, because people build institutions based on their sin. So I think we have to go with an awareness of possibility. Right. So it's a tough conversation.
And I would say, where I land too, and it's helpful to because I feel once again, we're people of extremes to just land on either there's this is not a problem at all, or this is
the biggest problem our society faces today.
And every cop is racist, right? I would say there's if you have a Venn diagram of two circles, one is racism, one is cops, right? Right. There is some overlap. Yep. But in general, racism is bad, mm-hmm. and having cops is good. Yep. Right? Right. There's some overlap where some cops are racist, and that's bad, right? Yep. So, and I think defining, it's we talked, go listen to episode 5, mm-hmm. defining terms, landing on the same biblical truth, then going back and saying, how do we get there? Yeah. Maybe is a good conversation to have.
That's good. Next question. What is anti-racism?
Oh, yeah.
Anti-racism is the act of being anti-racism. Next question is, sometimes the dictionary defines things that way. It's the most frustrating thing ever. It's right. Why did I come to... So anti-racism... is this idea that it's the idea of fighting racism. The dictionary definition is the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. So this is also kind of a CRT concept. And the concept, right, is that it's really not enough to not be racist personally.
Right.
You have to be anti-racist, and that you have to oppose kind of the structural forms racism takes in our day.
By the definition that they set.
By how they say
so
systemic racism
that's
takes place.
That's the linchpin here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I say, racism bad. But then did I, do exactly how they wanted me to not be racist? And if I didn't follow their guidelines,
right,
I'm not an anti-racist, so that means I'm complicit.
Right. And one thing that's been really helpful for me in this whole conversation about race is taking an application you want to make toward, I guess you could call racial justice.
Right.
And trying to apply that same application toward abortion to see if it sticks.
Right.
And what I mean by that is kind of the concept of anti-racism really is if you are not like an activist
right.
in this category, you're complicit.
Right.
So I'd ask the same thing of you with abortion. Like, where is the line on abortion where you would stop being complicit?
Right.
Is it you only and always vote for pro-life candidates?
Right.
Is it you do that plus you give money to your local crisis pregnancy center?
Right.
Is it that plus you also picket abortion clinics?
Right.
Is it that plus you also lobby your state legislature?
Right.
Like, where would activism be enough to remove your complicity from abortion?
Right.
So I think you should think about that as you apply it to the race thing. Like, how much is enough to make you stop being complicit? And I think what you begin to see is it's a very slippery slope.
Yeah, and I would say I would personally warn against using this term and buying into this, because it's kind of like if you don't support Antifa, you must be a fascist.
Right.
People have used that logic, and it doesn't make it. I'm like, it's just like good branding, maybe.
Right.
But but just because you don't support Antifa doesn't make you a fascist, right? But what anti-racists will say is, if you are not an anti-racist, that means you are a racist,
right?
By their definitions.
Right.
And I would say we need this anti-racism, this idea of in our culture of anti-racism, using this term, I would say is not biblical, and is not, as Christians, we shouldn't buy into this ideology. We should use biblical terms and biblical ideas of ethnicity and biblical ideas of how to bring justice. Right. So,
yeah, that's good. That's good. All right. Next question I'll give specifically to you. I think this was asked to you, certainly not to me. Thoughts on raising a biracial kid?
My first thought is, man, I bet my kids will qualify for a lot of scholarships. So I'd be thinking about that. I think, I guess it depends on what the two races are, or the two ethnicities are.
Sure.
Like I married a white woman, so I guess my kids are technically half majority, half minority, right? That's why it gets a little confusing. But man, I wonder what this person would specifically want to know about raising a biracial kid. I'll tell you what we do. How about that?
Sure.
I don't know if there's a right way to do this. I would say we are raising my kids, when my kids go to my parents' house, I have them only speak Chinese to them, because I want them to experience my ancestors' culture, right? But we don't raise our kids as you're half Asian, half white. They're our kids and we love them. Right? But the way they're going to grow up, I'm not ignoring my Asian heritage, my Chinese heritage.
Yeah.
They're going to grow up with red envelopes and celebrating Chinese New Year and eating for Thanksgiving we have lo mein and steak. Yes. They're gonna grow up with that. Yeah. And I think it's cool.
Yeah.
And they're gonna grow up with my wife's side of the family with more traditionally American traditions, and I think it's great. And I'm really excited about even food wise. I ate Chinese food growing up. I didn't have Mexican food until I was like a teenager.
Right.
And so it was like new to me. I'm very excited my kids get to such a wide range.
Right.
And I think they have an advantage of seeing multiple cultures in the household, growing up to be more broad in how they think about life and about people. So, I mean, I think biracial kids have an advantage, have a privilege in some ways.
There you go.
Because, if you grow up in an all-white household, all-black household, all Asian, you get one culture in your house, generally, right, as a whole. My kids get two.
Yeah.
So they already have an advantage of understanding how to bridge the gap between cultures because they've had to their whole lives.
That's good.
Right? And so I would say raise your kids. I think thoughts on raising a biracial kid, I would say, first of all, see your kid's identity not as biracial.
Good.
Like we've said.
Yep.
Raise them in the Lord.
Yeah.
I would say don't ignore the cultures you raised in, but I would say what we should be consciously trying to do in raising our kids is raise them in the Lord as Christians.
Yeah. It's good.
Everything else, I don't know. What do you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
I think anything beneath that, in terms of like, what food should we eat? Like, should I take them to my ancestors' countries? I'm like, yeah, if you want. If you don't want to, that's fine.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, they're born here. They're Americans. So I would say I wouldn't overthink it.
That's good.
How would you raise a non-biracial kid? Raise them like that too. I don't know.
Well said. Well said. So I'm going to combine the last two questions kind of in one question. How could a majority culture person better understand maybe the pressure to fit in from that a minority culture person experiences? And maybe kind of related to that, how does maybe a minority culture person help a majority culture person, tongue-tied, understand, like, oftentimes majority culture people just don't think about it. So
right.
how can minorities kind of help people in the majority talk about these things and understand, like, what life is kind of like from their vantage point?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could speak into this some, but I mean, I have thoughts for sure as a minority who has mostly majority culture friends.
Yeah.
I would say a couple things. One, we have to start with this, besides what we talked about biblically, but on a practical level. The way this happens is if you're in the majority culture, meaning in our culture, if you're white, go make some minority friends.
Right.
But I'll say this too. If you're in the minority, go make some white friends.
Right.
Right? If you keep saying white people don't understand me and you have no white friends, are you sure they don't understand you? How would you know? That's what I'm, it's like, like if you're white, don't complain about minorities unless you know some. Minorities don't complain about other minorities or white people or majority culture people if you don't know any, right?
Well said.
I think what, in my experience, what's been helpful is I've had a lot of minority friends and a lot of majority culture friends, and that has helped me have conversations with both. And I think a lot of it is like what you're saying, listening and all this stuff. But for me, it's expressing. I feel like our relationship is a helpful example. Mm-hmm. I tell you when I feel uncomfortable.
Yep.
I tell you when, and it's nothing ever you do, but it's like if we're at places or doing things, and that I feel like has been enlightening for you. Like, I know I didn't think about that. This could affect you in this way. So first of all, would you know if I didn't speak up?
No.
Yeah, I would. I have to speak up. But two, I've been lucky that all my best friends are white. And what I've seen a lot is in situations where something like racism could happen, or even when I was in like middle school being picked on or whatever, my white friends stepped up and stood up for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's a big part of it too, is not being, if you're in the majority culture, not being passive when you see something happen.
That's good.
And I've been really blessed by that, having friends who are, you know, not afraid to stand up for what's right. You know, all my best friends, including you, can be jerks at times, which is helpful in times when protection is needed. You know, I say that in all love. You know, I say that in all love. But I mean, it's really been helpful, and I think I've luckily had friends, and I know this is not everyone. Not every person stands up for what is right, but I've luckily had, the Lord's blessed me with friends who have always stood up for me in those times. So I would say, stand up for, if you see something wrong, stand up for it.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's good.
What did you say?
You know, I'm trying to think about how I have thought about this over. So I think, ironically, in high school, most of my best friends were Chinese or Indian. You know, I don't, know how that worked out. And then I think in my senior year of high school, I took my first mission trip to Costa Rica. And I've had the privilege of going to a lot of different countries on mission trips. And I think what happens when you go on a mission trip is, one, you really get to see how global God really is and the global nature of the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
But you also see and experience other cultures, and you begin to understand what I think is normal isn't necessarily like the worldwide definition of normal.
Right.
And for me, like an easy example of that is meetings should start on time.
Right.
And by on time, I mean the actual minute I say the meeting's going to start.
Right.
That's not an assumption shared by every culture in the world. You know, a lot of the places I've traveled, if church starts at 11 o'clock, it means people leave their house at 11 o'clock and walk 30 minutes to church. And church kind of has a rolling start for 30 minutes, right? So I think one of the things mission trips has helped me with is realize that how I define the way things should be and what normal is isn't necessarily a shared assumption around the world.
Right.
And so I just think, like, don't assume, and I think in general, people in the majority culture tend to just think the way they do things are the right way to do things and the normal way to do things.
Right.
Just don't assume that.
So, okay. So I'm going to try to explain this where it makes sense. But the thought I was just having is what you just said, is that part of what's helpful is if I tell you something, right? Mm-hmm. People in the majority culture, especially white American culture, just by definition of how the culture is one of like power and dominance and like you got to be the best, you got to be in charge,
right?
It's like you don't have to take that position with your minority friends. It's like if you understand it in the best way, it's like, okay, now I'll fix it for you. It's like, no, just be my friend.
Right, and just,
Yeah. And sometimes there's a place for I'll fix it for you. But a lot of it is like understanding the power dynamics and as a friendship, not using the power, like the power you think you have over your minority friend.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And that it goes along with what you just said. I think is like super helpful to understand.
Yeah, just and I do think, like, I think our sinful hearts can also lean toward self-justification.
Right.
So not only do I think my way of doing things is normal, I'm pretty sure it's right.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And everyone else is wrong. And
yeah.
sometimes that's true.
Yeah.
Right?
It's entering into the other culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, if you want to bridge the gap as a majority culture, enter into the minority culture. Not don't enter into the minority culture as don't enter into the Asian culture as a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
Enter into the Asian culture as a white guy who thinks he's an Asian guy.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, like taking on the mindset of like, I'm not going to be a white guy in this Asian culture. I'm going to be like, that's what Hudson Taylor did, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a British guy, but he's like, I'm an Asian guy in this Asian culture. And that's what my wife has done she's with my family.
Yep.
She's like proudly like, I'm a Chen, I'm Chinese. And you
Right.
know what? In some ways she's more Chinese than I am. But that's what you're saying,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah. I mean, one of the probably most helpful things for me was a mission trip training called Culture Link, which taught you how to like contextually prepare for your trip.
Right.
And I think taking those principles and applying it to conversations about race. And also the other thing too is just like if people are made in the image of God, it means they're interesting. So just like be interested in people.
Yeah.
Like stop talking so much and ask questions.
Yeah.
Like be interested in other people's life and their experiences, their peaks and their valleys, their culture. Just ask questions. Be interested in other people, where they came from and how they became who they are.
Yeah.
I just be interested. I think is helpful. So,
and I went through this great training as well. So yours was called Culture Link.
Culture Link.
Is that is that?
Yeah, I mean, you can Google it. It's in the Atlanta area, but you can attend trainings. I would highly recommend them.
And there's an online thing that I did. It's a little long, incredibly helpful, called openmindplatform.org.
Nice.
And it will teach you about some of the stuff we talk about here. But if you actually spend the time, and it'll take you 5 hours to go through it. But it's in 7 sections, so you could do it in parts. You will have many more tools to do this.
Yeah.
To have conversations with minorities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, that's all the questions we've got. Thanks for journeying with us through this long series.
Yeah.
Any closing thoughts as we bring the series to an end and talk about dinosaurs for our next episode? That is seriously our next episode.
Yeah. I mean, I just, thank you guys for coming along this journey with us. Once again, if you have questions and comments, come talk to us in person.
Yeah.
Or set up a meeting. We'd love to talk to you. And
absolutely.
Of course, the next logical episode to have after race is dinosaurs.
Naturally.
So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. So buckle up. All right. Well, thanks for listening. And we will talk to you when we talk about dinosaurs.